Are American politics broken? Or have we just lost the art of living in a democracy?
In a sense, you might say, we haven't forgotten how to agree in America, we've forgotten how to disagree. We're not very good at disagreeing constructively, and that's what a reacquaintance with our Constitution could help us learn.
We live in an age of political gridlock, as Americans have grown increasingly polarized. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people has ground to a halt, with neither party willing or able to use their platform for much more than demonizing the other side. Many Americans have therefore concluded that the Constitution, with its complex separation of powers demanding constant compromise, is either fundamentally flawed or simply unworkable in today's more diverse society. But what if we are divided less because our Constitution is failing us than because we are failing the Constitution? What if the friction in our political system is a feature, not a bug, put there by our founders precisely to force us to figure out how to find common ground? It's a bold claim to make in such partisan times. But for the theory's proponents, the current dissatisfaction with our messy democracy betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of what unity looks like in a country as diverse as ours.
Unity is a very hard term to define in modern America. We often think of it in very simplistic ways. It's just, if we all agreed, we'd all get along, and everything would be great. But in a free society, it's impossible for everybody to agree. As long as people are free to arrive at their own conclusions about things and have their own interests and their own priorities, there will be disagreements. And in a free society, therefore, unity really means not thinking alike, but acting together. The question for us is always, how can we act together when we don't think alike? The core purpose of our constitutional system is to answer that question and give us various ways of acting together even when we don't think alike. That's what unity means for us.
It's important to remember just how radical the American idea of freedom was at the time of our founding. We take it for granted today. But in the 18th century, the notion that every citizen should be free to speak and believe as he or she wishes was, quite literally, revolutionary. But the framers of the Constitution also recognized that even in a society where all viewpoints are equal before the law, not every viewpoint can actually become law. When legislation is signed, some people's ideas will win out, and others will lose. How then, the framers wondered, could such decisions be legitimate in a diverse society where a huge segment of the populace is almost guaranteed to disagree with them?
Well, the Constitution answers that question by pointing to coalition building. Our system of government is intended to make it possible for the majority in our society to make decisions without oppressing the minority in our society. It has a Bill of Rights that contains some limits on what government can do to us, but it also is built in a way that compels majorities to grow and be broad and durable before they're really given a lot of power. In order to be genuinely legitimate public action, an action of our government has to be representative of a reasonably broad slice of our society. And reasonably broad doesn't just mean 50% plus one. We have to work to build broad majorities. And that means working to build broad coalitions. That makes for a lot of frustration, but it also makes for a more fair and just and legitimate government.
This emphasis on consensus and compromise goes a long way toward explaining many of our system's most distinctive elements relative to other Western democracies, whether it's channeling votes for president into the Electoral College, or making the decidedly non-proportional Senate the more powerful of the two houses of Congress, or giving unelected judges great leeway to strike down acts of government as unconstitutional. American democracy has always forced the tide of public opinion to pass through the filter of its minority voices, giving all people a chance to be heard. These constraints have been controversial since the time of our founding, but the criticism found new life in the early 20th century following industrialization. Progressives like President Woodrow Wilson, seeing a need for government intervention in the wake of such dramatic social and economic upheaval, were fed up with the roadblocks that the constitutional process put in the way of any quick, decisive response. They sought to enable the president to take more unilateral action without the need for congressional approval or oversight. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's essentially the kind of presidency we have today. It's also a far cry from how our founders envisioned the executive's role.
If you read the Constitution, the branches are described in order. And Congress is clearly the most powerful branch of government. It is clearly intended to be first and foremost. It makes the laws that everybody else has to live by. And it also has a lot of power over the functioning of the other branches. The president is allowed to intervene some in Congress's work of making laws, to propose laws, to veto legislation that the president doesn't like. But ultimately, the president's job is to provide a stable backdrop for American life. I think we've forgotten this very, very crucial factor in the president's job, the necessity of stability. That means that a new president coming in can't just undo everything his predecessor did and then spend the first 2 years doing all kinds of things that his successor is going to undo.
As the executive branch increasingly comes to rely on a brute force approach to governing, the other two branches have embraced similar tactics, setting off a sort of parliamentary arms race to the bottom. In the judicial branch, activist judges have moved the courts away from their role as neutral arbiter between parties to become what is essentially a back channel for policymaking. Rather than resolving what the law is, these judges are instead taking it upon themselves to decide what the law should be. Meanwhile, Congress, hoping to reassert its constitutional authority, has in recent decades made a series of internal rule changes, giving party leaders more power to set the legislative agenda and enforce party discipline. Left without opportunities or incentives for working across the aisle, many rank-and-file members have abandoned even the pretense of cooperation and embraced roles as frontline troops in the culture wars.
The nature of a legislature is that it brings together representatives of people who are very divided and forces them to deal with each other. A lot of what's wrong in Congress now is that members are not dealing with each other. They see their job not as bargaining and negotiating, but as expressing the disagreements that their voters feel with others in America. And so Congress has become a kind of performative stage. If you attend a congressional hearing now, what you'll find is a lot of people producing YouTube clips. They're not really hearing each other. They're not really dealing with each other.
So how do we make our government work again? Obviously, it's complicated. Things didn't fall apart overnight, and won't be fixed overnight either. But if we're going to get anywhere, our first goal must be to break our national obsession with efficiency as the sole measure of good government, because that's how we got in this mess to begin with.
It's important to get the diagnosis right, because if you think Congress needs to be more efficient, then you actually want more centralized power, you want more powerful partisan leaders, you want the president to be able to set the direction more so things get done. If you think Congress is failing to facilitate bargaining, then you actually want a less efficient Congress. You want the committees to do more of the work, you want more back and forth, you want more haggling and horse trading. Those are opposite directions for reform, and that's why it's really important to begin by asking ourselves what's wrong before we think about what to do about it.
It may seem odd that the solution to our legislative gridlock is to make Congress less efficient, but the problem we face is not that majorities can't act. It's that majorities don't exist. The goal of these reforms should be not to make it easier in the short term for the ruling party to get its way, but to make sure that the ruling party's decisions represent the will of as broad a swath of society as possible, so that its actions will endure for the long term.
Most of the time in American history, our politics has looked like a majority party working to hold together a broad coalition and a minority party working to grow its coalition. Since about the mid-1990s, we have lived with a politics in which there are two minority parties. They both essentially lose every election because winning a House majority of 2 votes is not really winning anything. It doesn't enable you to really get much done. The parties have to see that this isn't working for them, that they need to grow, and that in order to grow, they have to lean into coalition building and lean into the structure of our constitutional system.
The republic that our founders established places the government firmly in the hands of we the people, but it also demands a lot from us in return. Some critics see our current gridlock as proof that we as a society are no longer able to handle this responsibility. But for others, this duty is less a burden than an opportunity, a reminder that the future is ours to write, and that, despite how bad things might look right now, our current problems aren't the final word for us as a nation.
I think it's very important for Americans to understand that this is by no means the worst moment in our constitutional history. And we should see that what we're doing is like what the framers of the Constitution did. It's like what everybody who followed them did. We're trying to make this very diverse, divided, dynamic, crazy country work. That's never easy, And the fact that things aren't working easily doesn't mean they're not going to work. Americans don't have the luxury of just folding our arms and saying, when is somebody going to show up to fix this problem? At the end of the day, it is our problem. And we always have to be able to talk about the challenges this country faces and the strengths it has as ours, as belonging to us, and as being our responsibility. So that even when we say Congress is doing a terrible job, what we're really saying is, at the next election, I have to ask myself if this person should be reelected or not. So we have a job to do, and we have every reason to think that we can do it.